What do we do?
Are we not men?
Arcadian is a brand new horror film directed by Benjamin Brewer and starring Nicolas Cage as a father of two young boys who live in a world that has gone through some sort of event. And it doesn't tell you what that event was. The movie opens with him finding these two twin boys. Maybe they were his, maybe they weren't. It never is very clear about that either. But then it time jumps 15 years and you see that mankind can now live on Earth like they used to during the daylight hours. However, at night, there is something that comes out, a creature of some sort that hunts humans and wants to kill them. And so they have to barricade themselves in their houses every night in order to avoid these creatures. Now that's a pretty cool concept and it really reminded me of A Quiet Place. I am going to make some references to A Quiet Place in this review because that's really how I felt while watching this. Was like, oh, I felt like somebody watched A Quiet Place and then took notes and made their own universe sort of adjacent to A Quiet Place. So it feels like that. I'm going to make some references to that. But with that said, I had an enjoyable time. And if you want to check out Arcadian, it is currently playing in theaters. You should go check it out there. With that said, let's get into some of my positives and some of my negatives. My first positive for this movie is going to be the creature design. I actually thought the creatures looked pretty cool. There are some moments in them where the creature design kind of goes off the rails, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But initially, when you're first seeing the creatures, you only get glimpses of them, and that's very effective. Kind of scary at times too. You see these monsters with their arms and their arms can extend and these claws come out of their arms. That's really well done. And then you get little glimpses of their faces, especially the first time you get a glimpse of their face. It's a pretty effective jump scare. So again, I thought the creature design for the most part was pretty good. I also enjoyed the tension in this movie. I thought they were able to build tension so well for the first act and a half of this movie. The movie really centers around these humans that are trying to avoid going out at night, but then circumstances lead to more circumstances, and so they have to go out at night and they have to take the fight to these creatures. And so it's sort of building that tension. And if you watch the trailer tells you, hey, this is where the movie's going to lead. So you, the viewer, again, if you've seen the trailer, you sort of know that's the direction the movie's going to go into, or at least that was my experience with this movie. So I thought, okay, how are they going to keep me invested in the story? But they find ways, whether it's scratch marks on the door the next day after they've already replaced the wood, and you could see these creatures were trying to scratch their way into the house, whether it's the people sitting in the house listening to these monsters outside. Again, a lot of good tension built in with some little scares along the way. Worked really well. And my final positive for this movie is the way that they told the story, because like I said, again, you have Nicolas Cage finds these twin boys. Maybe they were his, maybe they weren't. The movie's not clear. Time jumps 15 years, so you don't really know what happened in the big event. You don't know what's happened in the last 15 years. You just finally get to this farm with Nicolas Cage and these two 15-year-old boys. And these boys now are learning the story of the events that happened, and you, the viewer, are learning it along with them. So they didn't have to exposition dump on you because nobody really knows what happened. If Nicolas Cage knows, he doesn't tell. And if the two young boys have heard anything, they're not really sure what's true and what's not. You have one of the boys trying to study these creatures during part of the movie. You have the other boy in this movie who is friends with a teenage girl that lives at another farm. And so he and that girl talk to each other about, what do you think it was? Could it have been humans that were turned into these monsters? Could these monsters be from another planet? Who knows where they're from? And so you are learning along with them. And while the movie ultimately never really gives you any satisfaction on that story, I thought learning about it with them, or sort of going back and forth with these characters on what they thought the monsters could be, lended itself to the storytelling, and I thought the story was done really well. But that'll lead me to my negatives. My first negative for this movie is that while Nicolas Cage is in this movie, and he's one of my favorite actors of all time, he's not in this movie very much. He is in the first act for sure, and then very sparingly throughout the rest of the movie. And I was really hoping for another deep dive into Nicolas Cage acting, and you don't get that in this movie. He's barely there. He's there to sort of be the reason these teenage boys want to get out of the house. These boys want to rebel and sort of be teenage boys. And then he gets sidelined for the majority of this movie. And again, for me, a fan of Nicolas Cage, that rubbed me the wrong way, so I am going to put it in the negatives. My next negative for this movie is going to be that while the movie looks and feels a lot like A Quiet Place, because it really does. People living on a farm, people trying to evade these monsters. Again, a lot of footnotes from A Quiet Place. However, it doesn't have the character development that A Quiet Place had. As things were happening to characters in A Quiet Place, you felt for them. You felt emotionally tied to those characters because of the story they were able to tell through that movie. However, in this movie, you don't really feel emotionally invested in most of the characters. I guess there's a case to be made about one of the teenage boys you might get emotionally invested with, but not too much. Ultimately, they don't spend enough time developing the characters in this movie. They spend more time on the tension, they spend more time on the creatures, and while those are good aspects of the movies, and I put them in my positives, it's the characters not really being defined throughout this movie where it doesn't emotionally bring you to the end of this movie. So by the end, when people start to get taken out by these different monsters, you're not really attached to them. You're just kind of like, oh, all right, well, okay, that sucks. Yeah, it's a hard world to live in, this Arcadian world. So it's that their characters weren't developed enough for me to care about them. And my final negative for this movie is that monster design. Now, we talked about it in the positives. I thought the monster design was cool for the most part when they were giving you little glimpses. However, like most creature features, once you see the creature, it's not very scary anymore. And maybe it wasn't supposed to be. At a certain point, when you see a full creature in a movie, I just have to come to the realization I'm not supposed to be scared of it anymore. However, these creatures are not as polished or not as clean looking as the creatures from A Quiet Place. And if you're going to borrow story beats and monster look to an extent from A Quiet Place, the creatures have to be to that standard, and they're just not. They do this weird snapping thing with their jaws, and then they look like they're starting to convulse, and I don't know why they do that. I don't know why that decision was made, other than just to make it a little more shocking, maybe to hide how bad the creatures actually look, because as they're convulsing, you can't really see them very well. That could be it. I'm not 100% sure. All I know is that once I saw these creatures, I was like, oh, this isn't as polished as A Quiet Place, and it shows. And so this movie, unfortunately, just seems to feel like a knockoff of the Quiet Place movies. Overall, I'm not saying that I had a bad time with this movie, because I enjoyed it, and I would watch more movies in this universe. However, it just makes me want to watch more Quiet Place universe movies, which we are getting a new one. We're getting A Quiet Place Day 1. It's a prequel to the other Quiet Place movies later this year. So this movie just made me want that more. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing for Arcadian, because it makes me want to watch another franchise. But again, I would watch more movies in the franchise. And I will say that if you're a Quiet Place fan, I think you'll enjoy Arcadian to an extent. Maybe not to the point that you enjoy Quiet Place, because again, it's just sort of a lesser version of it. But those are just my opinions, because that's my review for Arcadian. Guys, have you had a chance to see Arcadian yet? If you have, let me know in the comment section down below what your thoughts were, where we agree or disagree. Maybe you got something else out of it. Maybe you saw something in it that I didn't. I would love to know your thoughts, and I love talking to you guys about movies. So again, talk to me in the comment section down below about how you feel about Arcadian. And with all that said though, guys, if you like this video and you want to watch more, don't forget to hit the like button, because it helps the video, it helps the channel, and it helps me right here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Alright guys, we got to the end of my Arcadian review, and again, not enough Nicolas Cage. I feel like if he had been more prominent in this movie, I might have enjoyed it even more, and maybe this would have been higher up on my list for movies I've seen in April so far. But we have more movies coming out in April, and on that note, if you want to check out all of the upcoming movies that are coming out in 2024, well, I've got a list of those right there, and I've got all of my 2024 movie reviews right there.